Give me a moment.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for your time. I hope it's worth your Saturday. I'll explain the significance of writing 2021 the way I've written here as we move along. So the book is The Good Ancestor, How to Think Long-Term in a Short-Term World. The author is Roman Krasnaric. That's how you pronounce. He's actually an Australian, born in Australia. And the book was written in July 2020. I happened to read it last month on a recommendation from one of my friends. He said it's an excellent book, and it turned out to be excellent. So I just thought that I'll do a book review for all of us, and I hope that it's helpful. So this author, he's written other books like Empathy, The Wonder Box, Carpe Diem Regained, The First Beautiful Game, Stories of Obsession in Real Tennis. He's also a leading rank holder in amateur tennis, real tennis. And he turned towards philosophy around 15 years back once he saw what's happening around us, and he decided to be a good ancestor. So the book is basically going to talk about how to think long term in a short term world. What he emphasizes on is that as we are living longer, we are thinking shorter. And he explains this very nicely with what we see on the right hand side, that around 100 billion people till date have died. The living are 7.7 billion, but the unborn generation is around 6.75 trillion. So the people who are yet to be born are in the orange color. So we are just a very small, minute, let's say, existence in terms of what is yet to come. Now, in terms of short-term thinking, Japan's reckless destruction of its old growth forests in the 17th century, the government's putting more criminals behind bars rather than dealing with the deeper social and economic causes of crime, bailing out insolvent banks after a crash rather than restricting the financial system are some of the examples which he shares in the book, and they seem quite right from that perspective. So he then moves on to explain that actually as human beings, we have had long-term thinking inbuilt in our mind since ages. But because of digital revolution, we have been forced to think short-term. So it explains, very well with one of the videos. I'll click on it and I'll see if you can see that.
The audio is not coming through.
Yeah. Can you hear it now?
No, not yet.
Not yet?
No.
Just 1 second, let me see.
Yeah, when you're trying to share it through, enable the option called audio.
Yeah, actually, I have just linked it there, but
Okay.
because I can hear the video.
It's coming now.
It's coming? Okay, perfect.
It's low something. There is some voice, but I don't think it is the same thing.
I think audio is not coming.
Yeah, not coming.
You can't hear it, Amar?
No, some sound maybe. He got.
Might have. Yeah, some background noise. Amar, you might have thought.
Correct.
And Roman proposes we start weaning ourselves off our marshmallow brain that's addicted to short-term rewards and rely more on our Econ brain, that's capable of long-term planning. So he also says that Econ thinking was a game changer for the hunter-gatherers. Around 12,000 years ago, in the early Neolithic period, one of our ancestors did something extraordinary. Instead of eating a seed, she decided to save it to plant the next season. This moment began the agricultural revolution, because of which we are all alive today. So what he says is that there are ways in which we can cultivate long-term thinking. We just have to start utilizing our Econ brain and not the marshmallow brain. And the significance of that he just explained through that video, which explains that when people who with a marshmallow experience, if a marshmallow is placed in front of us, we would like to eat it immediately within 15 minutes and not think about the consequences of eating sweets. So that's the analogy that he's given as to the human psychology. So the book attempts to do so by offering a set of 6 visionary and practical ways to cultivate long-term thinking.
You want to put it in full slide mode?
Yeah, just one second.
Yeah.
Better now?
Yeah.
Okay. So he's talking about 6 ways to think long, and those 6 ways are deep time humility. I'll discuss all of them in detail. Legacy mindset, intergenerational justice, cathedral thinking, holistic forecasting, and transcendental goal. As against, what we have today in terms of short-termism, digital distraction, the hijacking of attention by technology, wherein we are all spending more and more time on the mobile phones and maybe not using time constructively and only thinking about the present. The perpetual progress, which is the pursuit of endless economic growth, which means that there is only a exponential growth. So all of us want returns today. It is also proven psychologically that if we are given $2,000 today, we would rather accept it today than rather wait for $5,000, let's say after 2 years. And these are all experiments which he and his team have conducted, and they have found out that it is all true. So he's just talking about how can we think differently. And these are the 6 ways which he suggests that we can do so. So the first one is deep time humility. Which means that humility is not thinking less of yourself, but it is thinking of yourself less. And he has given some very good examples. For example, there is a museum in US where there is a tree oak which is being placed there in the museum, and this tree is almost 8,000 years. The oak is around 8,000 years old, which means that we do have sensibilities of thinking long term, and it's only that how do we implement it. And tech firms are in the business of immersing us in digital present that distracts us from pursuing goals of our own choosing, and against which long-term thinking can hardly compete. And over here is the significance of what I spoke about earlier, wherein one of the examples of deep time humility is that we just add a 0 to the number of years which is currently. So it is 2021. So we just start writing 0201. What would happen with this is that we can start to imagine tens of thousands of years into the future. One of the experiments also which he suggests in the book, which is a very good experiment, is that we all can do it. It'll just take a few seconds. Let us all close our eyes and imagine either our children or our nephew or niece or anyone who is much younger to us and whom we love, 30 years from now, let us all close our eyes and do that experiment. 30 years from now, we see their joy, we see their struggle, we see how they're living. And then we consider them at the age of 90, where there are wrinkles, on their face, and they have grown old, but they are still smiling. And we, through their eyes, just look outside the window and we see how the world is at that point in time. And then at that point, there is a great grandchild placed into the hands of our 90-year-old kid. And at that point in time, we just have to imagine that what do we leave as ancestors towards our kids, so that as an author, Roman, he believes that tomorrow is going to be darker. Now, that's not my personal view. My personal view is that tomorrow is going to be better than today. But nevertheless, how do we and what do we implement which leaves a better world for our kids? So I think this experiment will obviously make us think twice before all that we do at this time. And it's a good experiment for us to, implement it time and again before we endlessly run behind money and endlessly try and use resources which are there on the planet. This is also an experiment which he does, which brings tomorrow closer to today. If you look at now is, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. If we look at nowadays, it's just 30 years, the last decade, this decade, and next decade. And if we consider the long now is, 12,000 years earlier and 12,000 years from now. And what has happened till now is just tip of the iceberg. So if we consider the human evolution from your nose to the tip of the nail, if you just strike the nail off, that's the only thing which is where we are today. That's the only, the whole history will be wiped out. So what is still remaining is the length of the arm up to the tip of the nose. And we have already started depleting the resources of this earth. So what are we going to leave for the people tomorrow? I think that's what the book talks about. And one of the guys who implemented this experiment earlier, his name is Jonas Salk. So he's the inventor of polio vaccine in 1955. And he's the one who talks about how can we be good ancestors. And I don't know, all of us, if we have read about the S curve or the sigmoid curve, and he was the inventor of that sigmoid curve. And what he talks about is there is no exponential growth in terms of how things are going to increase with time. There is going to be an inflection point after which there is going to be a decline. So based on observations of biology that show population growth tends, which tend to form a sigmoid, Salk predicted that worldwide population growth accelerating from less than 1 billion in around 1800 to 7 billion by the end of the 20th century, it would reach an inflection point and then begin to slow down. And in fact, we have reached that inflection point now, where the population growth will start to deaccelerate. What it means is that it is expected that by the end of 21st century, we'll be either 10 billion or 13.5 billion, depending on how we use the Earth's resources. and how resources are available for us to be exploited. But having said that, I think from the beginning of the Common Era, the size of the human population grew gradually for about 16 centuries. And then with increasing speed through the 19th
ಇಲ್ಲ
century,
ನಂದು
and then obviously, as I say, it gradually started to decline.
ನಂತವಿಲ್ಲ ಏನಾಯ್ತು
And one of the important concepts here is that nothing grows forever. I think that's the most important lesson for us from the sigmoid curve, that whatever goes up has to come down. So there can be no infinite exponential growth. And what he refers in the book is that most of the companies, they are all working on a quarter-on-quarter basis, wherein the quarterly results need to be positive, and there needs to be an exponential growth. Sales need to grow exponentially, but at the expense of what? At the expense of utilizing the resources, whether it's human resources, whether it is resources of the earth, but there are places where the limits are going to be set, and hopefully he thinks by then we have not overexploited the resources of the earth where there is no U-turn possible. The next thing that he talks about is the Wakapa culture. I don't know if you all have heard about it. What it means is to plant trees you will never see. And the Wakapa culture is being used by the New Zealand rugby team. I'm sure you would have seen that dance that the rugby team of New Zealand has. So they live by the philosophy of Wakapa, which calls on them to both represent the players who came before them and create a legacy for those who will follow. I see there are some chats here. One minute. I can't see it.
Oh, sorry,
Someone
that's
asking
just
something?
no, that was just me commenting. It's okay. I'll refrain.
Okay. One of the other examples that he gives is about Wangari Maathai. She's the one who started the Green Belt movement in 1977 in Kenya. She won a Nobel Peace Prize in 1977. Through this Green Belt movement, there are 51 million trees that have been planted in Kenya. So he says that long-term thinking is possible. Deep humility is possible. It's only people like Wangari and Jonas Salk who are thinking about it. He says that it is all of us that should start thinking on those lines, and it's just about time when 30 to 40 years from when we have started to implement things that we want to see as a change, and we'll be able to see in 30 to 40 years. He says that as a human civilization, I know that we should be thinking, he says that we should be thinking 100, 200, 300 years from now. But even if we start thinking 30, 40 years as individuals, we will be able to bring about changes to the way that we are living at this stage. Then he talks about cathedral thinking, which is long-term thinking, which has been inbuilt in our society from many, many years ago. So 5,000 years ago, we have seen cathedrals which are still being constructed, cathedrals and universities which are existing since last 200, 300, 400, 500 years. All these universities in the US, Oxford University, they have been there for 200, 300 years. And these are all the examples that I've given. I'm not going to go in the details of these examples, but it surely shows that we do have cathedral thinking in our mind, and cathedral thinking is nothing but long-term thinking in terms of public policies, in terms of cultural projects, in terms of infrastructure projects. in terms of religious buildings. In terms of religious buildings, one of the examples that he gives is the Minster, which is a cathedral in Germany. This cathedral was, it started to be built in 1377, and it is still under construction. So they keep it alive, and they keep doing some kind of a construction. So it's been almost 700 years, and the construction is still ongoing, which means that there are examples where we can think long term, and this is one of the examples. Then the other example that he gives is about the Great Stink in UK. I don't know if you guys have read about it, but the Great Stink in UK was when there was no sewage drainage in the UK in 1877 or 1876, and during that time there was cholera in the UK. The scientists at that point in time developed a drainage which is still existing today, 100 years from then, where the drainage pipes were built, which took around 25 to 30 years to build, but they are still being utilized today, and it's called the Great Stink. And what it also shows is that until and unless people don't fall into crisis, we don't really go ahead and implement something. And he says that unfortunately, the resources of the climate of the earth cannot be exposed to that extent where, in case of Great Stink, we were able to recover, but we might not be able to recover once the resources are depleted from this one planet that we have. So, these are some of the examples that he gave, and which made sense from that perspective. He also gives an example of a book which is called as The Star Maker. It was written by a British writer, Olaf Stapledon, in 1937. And what this book talks about in 1937 is that, apart from all the other things, that in 60, 70 years time, which is now, people are going to have some kind of radio device which they are going to be engaged with all the time, which means it's a mobile phone. And we'll be so engrossed in the mobile phone that is in the present that we'll forget what we are supposed to do in the future. And you can imagine, this book was written in 1937 by this guy when mobile phones were not even existing at that time. And he just mentions about a radio device. So it's a futuristic book, which he wrote around 60, 70 years back, and which is true. So again, the deep humility and long-term thinking was always inbuilt in the human psychology. The only thing is that we have to enable that part of the brain so that we start thinking long-term. The next point he talks about is intergenerational justice, which means that how can we think about the people who are still unborn. So the people who are not born today, they can't stand up for themselves. They can't talk about what are their needs. They can't talk about how can we not manipulate and exploit the current resources. And then what are we, talking about, or what is it that we are leaving for 7 generations ahead? And now there are a lot of countries which have started implementing intergenerational justice, wherein the voice of the people of tomorrow is going to be considered today. So there is something which is called as the Intergenerational Solidarity Index, which is a measure of how much different nations provide for the well-being of future generations. And you can see India doesn't come into this at this stage, but it's still limited to a lot of countries only in Europe. US also doesn't fall into this. So we can see that most of the countries in the world are exploiting the resources, and not thinking about what is it that we can leave for the future generation. So Iceland is on top. Now it's easy to say and think that these are countries which are small, and maybe that's the reason why they are doing it. But I think from my personal perspective, if we consider India to be with different states, and even if we consider European Union, which has different countries, we can still implement it state-wise or city-wise, and think about what can we leave for the future generation, and what is it that we can implement for the well-being of the future generation. So in fact, they have a part of their parliamentary process. They have members in the parliament who are responsible for intergenerational justice in the future. Now, obviously, it will take some time in terms of really implementing it. From a political aspect, the politicians are only thinking about how can they survive in the next election. They have got nothing to do with what is going to be implemented, let's say 60, 70 years from now. So I think, yeah, that is what this part suggested. And the person whom we saw, in the previous slide, so Rolf, who was the first person to discuss intergenerational justice in 2012, he says that it is the respect for the rights and duties with regard to future and past generations, which is also called as transgenerational. Then there is a debate in the book which talks about, is it possible that the countries which are not democratic are the ones who are thinking long term? Let's say, for example, China. So is the autocratic way the way to lead a country and not a democratic way? And then all these countries were studied, and what was found was that long-term democracies are all democratic democracies. So China is slightly an outlier, but otherwise all the China and Singapore, but all the other countries, if you see, the most who are the long-term democracies, who are the long-term thinkers, are the democratic countries. So what it means is that there is no proof that is found that autocratic way of living, or the democracies which are not the democracies are the way to move forward. It is not that the way China is the way to think long term. So democracies can think long term. Now I missed out one slide, but India falls in the center here. India is falling here at this level. So we are still far behind where we should be, and I think it's a thought that we all can think about how can we make that change, and how can we think about the future. There are 4 or 5 things that he talks about which can be implemented in terms of understanding this and then leading it to leave something behind for the future generations. So the first one is the dark art of discounting. What it means is, just as a person appears smaller and smaller and further from us as they stand, discounting gives smaller and smaller weight to their interests the further they stand. What it means is that this is general discounting. So if as I mentioned earlier, if we are getting $2,000 today, we'll take it rather than wait for $5,000 tomorrow. So this even happens in the stock market. You all would have seen last year when people were investing and just coming out of it getting 10-12% return. There are only few people who would really wait for 20 to 40 years to get any long-term benefits. And this is just human psychology. We want short-term return, and the art of the dark art of discounting is an unfortunate part of that. So discounting is an iconic expression of the colonization of the future, treating it as virtually empty of inhabitants. So that's what we are thinking. We are thinking that we are not really bothered about the future. We will use the resources as they are today, and this goes in everyday lives of all of us. The way the number of clothes that we have, the number of cars that we have, the number of properties that we want. This is just the present, and there is no limit or there is no end to the kind of resources that we want for ourselves. And it doesn't matter the way the companies are, let's say, exploiting by what they're building. It doesn't matter to us. We just want to utilize what is there, which we have access to, and the amount of money that we want for our living. There is no limit. So we are not thinking about the future. We are only thinking about the present. He also talks about sustainable development is defined as a development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So, there are 4 moral motives for intergenerational justice. And these 4 arguments are founding principles that underpin the values of long-term civilization. These are the 4 motives. The arrow: treat people of equal work independent of when they happen to be born. The scale, which means weigh up the well-being of those alive today against all those that are yet to be born. The blindfold: imagine the world you did want if you didn't know into which generation you would be born. And the baton: treat future generations how you would want past generations to have treated you. I think the moment we start thinking about these things, maybe we might change the way we are mistreating the planet at this stage. And it's also related to the 7th generational thinking, which means that whatever we are doing today, how is it going to impact 7 generations from now? And as I said, the intergenerational data that I showed earlier, all those countries are thinking about how their actions are going to treat 7 generations from now. For example, there are some examples which were given in the book related to Norway. Even Ireland is an example. 28% of the energy requirements are met through wind energy in Ireland. 28% is massive, which means even in Norway, it took around, there are these farm windmills which are being set up in Norway. It took around 8 years to build, but what they expect is that those windmills are going to cater to 51% of the energy requirements in Norway. And these were all 6-8 years old, 6 to 8 year long-term projects, which have led to those kind of results. And then he talks about the transcendental goals, which means that there is perpetual progress is not something that is going to remain, as I spoke earlier. I think we as a human civilization need to consider that there is only one planet, and we have to meet the needs of all current and future people with this one planet that we have. So that's the kind of thinking that he talks about, is something that we need to start thinking. Do we all want to take a break or continue?
I'm good, Mayoor. I'm good at this point, but about the rest, yeah.
That's fine. Can continue.
Yeah, I think we can continue.
Okay. And then he talks about deep design principles for deep democracy. So, guardians of the future, citizen assemblies, self-governing city-states, intergenerational rights. So I'll give some examples. What are the citizen assemblies? So he has given example of Japan. So a Japanese citizens assembly that gathers residents to discuss plans for their areas. So half of the group look at plans from the perspective of today's residents, and the other half from the perspective of residents in 2060. wearing ceremonial robes to help their imaginations. The future group invariably advocates far more transformative and radical plans. So Japan's Ministry of Finance, numerous towns and cities, and corporates such as Fujitsu use this technique for sustainable development. And Japan is only one of the examples in the world which are using it. And a lot of European countries have now started thinking about it. But Japan has been using this since ages. If we look at the Japanese temples are more than 3,000 years old. One of the examples was, as mentioned, about the destruction of the trees in Japan in the 17th century. There was a monarch who came into play in the 18th century, and he made it compulsory that every living human being in Japan needs to plant 10 trees, or else he'll be shot dead. And we can see today that Japan has more greener, let's say, planet than anywhere else in the world, and that was one of the reasons why it has happened. And from there, that example of whether democracy is something that is suitable and whether an autocratic kind of a government is much better, but there is no such proof that democracy is not the way forward. But I think it's just the human psychology that we need to implement, which can take that thinking forward. The other thing that he talks about in the book is that instead of countries making a decision, it should be the cities that make the decision. You see cities like Mumbai, Tokyo. Mumbai has population of 20 million, 25 million unofficially. It's 5 times the size of Denmark or Ireland. Ireland is 5 million, which means that the cities will have to start taking control of these decisions rather than waiting for some central government body to really make that decision. So the thought is that the size of any city which is more than 1 million, it should be considered as a separate entity, and those cities can then make their own decision. And I think once that happens, then we will be able to see changes going forward. Because if we wait as a central or a direction from a central body, it might not lead to those kind of results. This is a very important concept, which has been bought by this book, and I think this was the best part that I learned from this book. You all can research on it, but it's called as Kate Raworth's donut model. You see, as we all were studying economics, and when we were studying economics, we saw that it's a circular chain. Money goes in, money comes out, and there is no impact of environment being considered. There is no impact on human resource being considered. There is no impact on collaboration being considered. And Kate, when she was studying economics, in Oxford, she left her studies and she decided to overturn the whole model itself. And she came up with this model in 2019. And she says that she was guided by the spirit of Buckminster Fuller, who is an American inventor. And she said, you never change things by fighting the existing model, but if you want to change things, you change the model itself. So she went ahead and changed this model. And she says that we need to meet the needs of all within the limits of this planet. There are no endless resources. And on every one of those social foundations, we are falling short at this stage. So if you see the social foundations include basic needs like water, food, health, education, political voice, social equality, gender equality. So these are the social foundations. And then there is an economic ceiling in terms of the resources that we have today. So climate change, ozone layer depletion, ocean acidification, chemical pollution, fresh water withdrawals. And what has been found is that on 4 of these indicators, we are already, we have depleted or almost reaching a stage of depleting those resources. And when it comes to the social foundation, you see all those areas are in red, which means that in order for a society to thrive and for the planet to survive, we need to live in this green zone. All the human beings, all the 7 billion or the 10 billion that are going to be there by the end of 21st century, they need to be in this green zone, which is called as the donut, which means that we can't exceed the number of resources that are there on this earth. And we also need to find ways and means where all the human beings do not have the shortfall of basic needs. Like as of today, 1 in 8 people don't have enough food, 1 in 5 people don't have electricity, and 1 in 5 people live then less than $1.25 a day. So which means that we are already short on this, on the ecological ceiling. So what is it that we can do in order for us to live in this green zone? And there are few companies that are, trying to inculcate this model into their organizational, let's say, sustainable model. And one of the companies is called as Houdini. Houdini is a Swedish sportswear company, which basically uses this model, and all their clothes, all their shoes, all that they manufacture is using this model, and they are very, very expensive, because to implement this model is not so easy. When you can reuse everything that you're producing, it is not extremely easy. Now, I had a video here, but I think that video is not working. But maybe you all can. I'll share it again, and you can look at this video. It's just a short video. So some of the examples in the book that are given is the great acceleration, which means that you see all the graph is already towards an incline, which means we are reaching an inflection point where it is going to fall down. This cannot be exponential growth for everything that is there in the world, whether it's population, whether it is foreign direct investment, water use, paper production. So you can see all of this. Paper use has increased exponentially. Motor vehicles have increased exponentially. Foreign investment has increased. Ozone depletion has increased. Paper use has increased, and this is all happening in this current century.
Last 100 years.
Yeah, which means that there is an inflection point, as per Jonas Salk, where things will fall down, and population, he has already started seeing that there is a decline now. And Japan, for example, we all know what's happening in Japan. There is people are living longer, but the next generation. China, for example, they had the one-child policy. Now they are in trouble. They have abolished it. So just one example which should make us think. This graph shows projected impact of climate change on agricultural yields, and between 2003 and the 2080s. So we can see that more than half of the world is in either red zone or orange zone, and there are only few countries which are in the green zone. Canada, for example, Russia, China to a certain extent, but otherwise all the other countries are in red zone. So it leaves us with a thought whether this is the way we want to go forward, and how is it that we can help not have any impact of climate on ourselves at this stage. And then he talks about, path of being a good ancestor. We need to outdo outdated institutional designs, the power of vested interests, insecurity of the here and now, insufficient sense of crisis. And I think in the economic realm, Roman brings together many examples of new ways of doing business that could ameliorate short-term economic incentives and are better suited to one planet thriving. Now, these could include taxing stock markets based on how long they're held, abolishing quarterly reporting, decoupling CEO bonuses from short-term performance, and also more ambitious ideas such as creating circular economies in which waste generated by one kind of activity is used as an input for another, an approach that is being already used in Canada and China. So it's an interesting book. If you all have time, then you can go through it or expand on the Rawat model that I've shared. And this is one more video. I think I'll send the slides. You all can have a look at it later. I think it's been an hour already.
Hey, thank you, Mayoor.